tough issues that our country is facing.
Does this mandate make sense?
That's the role of Face the Nation, to focus on the issues at hand. That means a civil, contextualized conversation with perspective.
60 Minutes.
60 Minutes.
60 Minutes.
60 Minutes.
New season begins Sunday on CBS. Tonight, the tech that helped authorities capture an escaped convict after a 2-week manhunt. Then, the latest on a formal impeachment inquiry into President Biden. And Norah O'Donnell with presidential candidate Ron DeSantis on where he stands on election-defining issues on the CBS Evening.
The leaders of the House Republican Conference have made their demands clear. Impeach Joe Biden without evidence, or we'll shut down the government.
The American people deserve transparency, and this impeachment inquiry is an important next step to deliver transparency, facts, and accountability.
At the end of another term, I'd be in my mid-80s. Frankly, it's time for a new generation of leaders.
We're the only democracy in the world where it's possible to lose a popular vote for the presidency and yet become president.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is defending his decision to open an impeachment inquiry against President Biden. Despite criticism from the White House, congressional Democrats, and indifferent shrugs from most Senate Republicans. Speaking to reporters today, McCarthy repeated allegations the president profited off his son's business dealings, allegations the White House has denied. McCarthy also defended not holding a floor vote before moving forward. The White House called all of this, quote, a baseless inquiry and extreme politics at its worst. For more on this, Catherine Herridge and Scott McFarland join us now. Catherine is CBS News senior investigative correspondent. Scott is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Catherine, I want to play for you and for the audience something the Speaker of the House said today about this idea that you can move forward without a formal House vote launching an impeachment inquiry. Let's listen to the Speaker of the House.
Nancy Pelosi changed the president of this House on September 24th. It was withheld and good enough for every single Democrat here. It was good enough for the judge. Why would it have to be different today? What we've learned in the last couple weeks, wouldn't you want to know the answer to?
That's a reference to the way the Ukraine impeachment was handled. You can look to the history for that. But what I really want to zero in on, Catherine, with you is what the last two sentences the Speaker were. What we've learned in the last couple of weeks, wouldn't you want to know the answer to? What do House Republicans think they've learned in the last couple of weeks relevant to this matter?
Well, they've had closed-door depositions from a number of the FBI and IRS agents who were involved in the Hunter Biden investigation. And they're focused very much on this October 22 meeting in which an IRS whistleblower has alleged that David Weiss, then the U.S. attorney, had said that he was not the deciding person for charges or venue in the Hunter Biden case and that he had been denied special counsel status. And that goes to their idea that there was preferential treatment in the investigation and that there were blocks that prevented investigators from following evidence that might have led to Joe Biden.
Might have led to Joe Biden.
Correct.
Do Republicans have evidence that they believe concretely links Hunter Biden and money and the president?
What they have through the bank records that they have subpoenaed is what they say is evidence that $20 million went to the Biden family. Their central allegation, I think, has evolved in recent months to being one that it was a scheme to enrich members of the family, of which Joe Biden was one, that Hunter Biden was trying to cash in and trade on the family name. And you're correct, there's not a smoking gun wire transfer that shows money going to the president, but it's clear from the banking records that the family did receive the benefits of Hunter Biden's foreign business deals.
On that point, I interviewed for my show, The Takeout, this week, Adam Smith, ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, and I brought up this idea about the impeachment inquiry and evidence gathered so far. Let's take a quick listen.
There's an incredibly complicated relationship between Joe Biden and his son Hunter. But after
a difficult one, let's be candid.
Absolutely. But after a very thorough investigation, it's 100% clear that no part of that relationship has led to any money winding up in Joe Biden's pocket. That is absolutely obvious at this point. So this impeachment inquiry is simply Kevin McCarthy once again trying to appease the extreme right-wing MAGA Republicans in his caucus.
Catherine, based on the record established so far by House Republicans, is it right or wrong for Adam Smith to say there is absolutely no evidence any money wound up in Joe Biden's pocket?
I think it's fair to say that there is ample evidence through the banking records that about $20 million went to the benefit of the Biden family. Hunter Biden, his children, President Biden's brother. There is no wire transfer that shows it's winding up in Joe Biden's bank account. But Devin Archer, who's a former business partner, essentially testified that that's kind of not how it works. How it works was about profiting off the family name. That was his allegation. And
in general,
but Joe Biden was a big part of the Biden brand.
Very good. Scott McFarlane, I want to bring you into this conversation because amid this, as you well know, and every member of Congress knows, House and Senate, spending bills have to be approved by the end of the month or there's going to be a shutdown. What are the soundings today on that front?
Oh, they're ominous as can be, Major. The House Republicans late today pulled off the floor from consideration a military spending bill, something that by congressional standards, appropriation standards, it's kind of the fundamental stuff, the easy stuff to pass because the military has a foothold and relevance in every district in America. They pulled it off the floor likely because they didn't have the votes to pass it. That is an ominous sign as we approach September 30th, as there are nearly a dozen spending bills to pass that are far more contentious traditionally than military spending. And there's this other dynamic that's growing, Major, and I think it's worth emphasizing this. As I spoke to dozens of members of the U.S. House today, notice members of the House Freedom Caucus, the more conservative members of the Republican Conference, were emphasizing that a government shutdown, should it happen October 1st, might not be a bad political thing for them back home. Take a listen to Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee.
Do you think some of your constituents would want a shutdown? Maybe some of them would support a temporary shutdown?
I think if we could reduce $32 trillion in debt, I think it could. I think they would, yeah, because they're ridiculous. They think this is ridiculous, and that's really the only tool we've got in our belt at some point.
That is a snapshot, Major, of the political reality of this moment, that there's going to have to be some bipartisan deal to avert a government shutdown. The Speaker of the House, who has just announced that impeachment inquiry, is under tough scrutiny from the Freedom Caucus moving forward, and that bipartisan deal might cost him the speakership. And there are Republicans, Major, who argue that a government shutdown is not only potentially beneficial, but maybe popular at home. Really mixes up the politics as that October 1st date looms ominously.
No doubt. And Scott, with this next question, I'm not trying to alarm anyone in the audience, but you know the phrase, is there a doctor in the House? I don't need one, but you have information about a doctor in Congress. Explain.
The health episodes involving Republican leader Mitch McConnell raised the profile of this obscure office of the attending physician in Congress. The in-house Capitol doctor, Brian Monahan, wrote a couple notes, doctor's notes for Mitch McConnell, which McConnell's staff released, saying McConnell is cleared to return to work despite those two freezing up incidents and despite the fact that Monahan had to check some testing results. Monahan himself is actually an outsized figure here on Capitol Hill. Our CBS News reporting found his office has about 50 staffers, now has about $4 million in taxpayer money behind them, and do all the checks of members of Congress whenever they're ill or under the weather or concerned about an ache and a pain when they're here in Washington. I had one Michigan Democrat tell me that the office of the attending physician saved his life, saw him when he was too busy to go outside for a doctor, and helped direct him to a specialist where he was ultimately determined to have had throat cancer, which was successfully removed earlier this year. It really is one of those internal things Congress has that may be viewed as a perk, but may also be argued as necessary for those triple-booked, way too busy members of Congress. And one side note, Major, no office here is immune from politics. The office of attending physician gets heat from Republicans for the COVID masking protocols and other restrictions that were in place in 2020 and 2021, and still being asked about it today.
Scott McFarlane, thank you so much from Capitol Hill. Catherine Herridge, thank you so much for being with me at the desk. A prominent columnist in Washington says President Biden needs to step aside in 2024. We'll discuss that story with our political panel next. You are streaming America Decides.
If
It's important to our nation.
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
It's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need
Thoughtfully, with context.
be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that it's happened on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
the threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether,
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
We will win re-election. There is too much at stake, and the American people know it.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was Vice President Kamala Harris on Face the Nation last weekend. Today, Washington Post columnist David Ignatius called for President Biden not to run again in 2024. After praising the administration's accomplishments, Ignatius wrote, quote, "I don't think Biden and Vice President Harris should run for re-election. I think Biden risks undoing his greatest achievement, which was stopping Trump." Leslie Sanchez and Chuck Rocha join us now. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and a Republican strategist who served in the George W. Bush administration. Chuck is a Democratic strategist and the president of Solidarity Strategies. He previously served as a senior advisor for Bernie Sanders in the 2020 campaign. Chuck, I want to start with you on this. David Ignatius is a significant figure in Washington. He is well connected in both parties, but particularly among Democrats, and his voice matters in at least the cocktail party circuit of Washington, D.C., which isn't as powerful as it used to be, but it is not without influence. How do you regard his column today, and what effect do you think it'll have on the Democratic conversation about the Biden re-elect campaign?
Well, there has been a conversation, but that was 6 months ago about what would really happen at the White House, because then you had time to do something as a Democratic Party. We could figure out, are we staying with the horse that got us here, or are we going to change horse in the middle of this stream? And the decision was made, and it's a little late now for this conversation to be had. Look, Joe Biden is getting older. We all know that. But the other guy who's going to probably be running against Donald Trump is getting older, too. And in focus groups that I'm doing, old and steady still beats old and crazy in what we're doing every day.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think David would do this, knowing, as you know, he knows that this is largely a decision that's already been made? Do you think he is speaking for some Democratic constituency, or just sort of putting a marker down in case things go south and he can say, hey, don't blame me, I told you?
I think that's a part of it. I mean, there's one thing about Democrats is it's organized chaos almost all the time. And there's lots of folks you can't keep happy and that probably aren't happy with Joe Biden. But Joe Biden got us here. The American people voted for something different than Donald Trump. And I think what Ignatius is doing is positioning himself to say, look, I said this early on, so y'all can't be blaming me.
Right. From an analytical perspective, I'm not suggesting that David Ignatius is a partisan, but just from an analytical perspective. That's all I'm saying. Leslie Sanchez, on the Republican side, there was news today. Mitt Romney not running for re-election and saying that he thinks a younger generation needs to step up. He referred to that at I think a press avail or in his video announcement. Let's go to that side if we can.
I considered my age and the fact that at the end of a second term I would be in my mid-80s. And I think it's time for guys like me to get out of the way and have people in the next generation step forward, because they're going to be shaping the world they're going to be living in.
That was an impromptu meeting with reporters, otherwise known in Washington as a scrum. Leslie, what's the import of this?
You know, the interesting thing about Senator Romney is he's always been somebody who's very principled. He stands and fundamentally takes those hard lines in positions he believes in. He does. I think anybody would argue and agree. He really believes that, and he's trying to set an example not just for Republicans, but certainly for the topic we're talking about, for the Democrats. Is this a cascading effect? I think the question that wasn't asked to my colleague, my friend here, Chuck, is it the tip of the iceberg when you're talking about the impact of age? Certainly with President Biden and Republicans. Nikki Haley on the presidential campaign has been talking about that.
Just about it every day. Every
day, because it is becoming a clear point in these focus groups. It's a clear point of contention in the back of voters' minds.
When Romney was asked, the senator was asked about his position in the Republican Party, he said it's a small position right now. The party is controlled by Donald Trump, which he said is the demagogue portion of the Republican Party. He says he represents the wise wing that he hopes will have, at some point in the future, maybe distant, a re-emergence. Where is the Republican Party absent Mitt Romney now?
I think a lot of people think that part of the Republican Party, even going back to Reagan, we heard a lot about former President Ronald Reagan, the Reagan generation, the impact of the Reagan generation, where there were so many people that came to run and stood on his shoulders as a Reagan conservative. You can't say that there's a large group of Trump populists, a Trump new Republican Party. There's not those lanes yet, but I increasingly believe that part of the Republican Party is more of a footnote. It's going to be in our recent history.
The Reagan part?
Look,
the Trump part?
I would say where Romney is, the establishment party, the big business, a big industry, Northeastern Republicans. Yeah, very much so.
That's probably why he couldn't win his primary, and that's another reason why he probably retired.
His primary, and it's so interesting because if you talk to voters and they say, oh, you know, Trump has, if you're looking at Trump and looking at a Romney, there is not a lane for a Romney type of Republican. They want an alternative.
Chuck, I want to ask you about a conversation that Democrats are having pretty much in the open right now, which is, one, poll numbers for Biden are worrisome and the sky might be close to falling. And then there's others like, calm down, he's fine. Actually, the underlying numbers, if you dig a little deeper, Jim Messina is certainly there, a very prominent voice in the Obama campaign and reelection campaign, said, don't worry about it. On which side of that ledger do you fall?
I've been running campaigns for 34 years, and I'd say I'm a little bit of both. As a Democrat, I get up worried every single day.
Right, but that's a given. But I mean, particularly with Biden and what you see in the data right now.
What's changed from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, is this partisan divide that you just described within your own party and within my party. People have run to their corners, and there's such little bit of America left in the middle that's undecided in just a handful of states, Major. You've been out on the road in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. This whole thing will be decided in 5 states. And guess what? It's 50-50 partisanship in either state, and such a small sliver. That's why we talk about Latino voters, black voters. If you don't get the exact same percentage that you got 4 years ago, if it drops off a percentage, every little percentage will matter, hence why I wake up worried every day.
And to that point, I'm not trying to stump you, but if this stumps you, I'll be happy. Name me a state that Biden won in 2020 you think he could lose, and one he narrowly lost you think he could win.
I think he could win North Carolina, and I think you could easily lose Wisconsin.
Leslie, same question for you about Trump or the Republican nominee. Let's assume it's Trump, but if not, a Republican, 2020, they lose one that they won, and they gain one they lost.
The challenge, and I want to be fair because I was thinking about this question consistently. The challenge, Major, is we're increasingly seeing a lot of these working class voters who identify as Democrats, but increasingly don't like or feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them. That's the old Reagan line. You feel you're doing better now than you were before. Because you have a lot of voters who don't necessarily register on those Latino voters being the same. They may be Democratic. We're going in the field right now. Democratic, they consider themselves self-identified Democrats, but who would vote for Trump over again in a state like Texas. They would like an alternative that is somebody not favorable to DeSantis, but they're looking for an alternative, and they're not going to be siding with the traditional Democratic Party.
So, do you have 2 states?
I would say I wouldn't put.
Do you think Trump could lose North Carolina?
I don't think at all. I don't think so. I think North Carolina is strong. I think.
Is there one he could win back that he lost?
I think we could be more competitive in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. All right. Leslie Sanchez, Chuck Rocha, good to have you with us. Thanks so very much. Rights for minority parties in legislative politics. Well, that's a staple of Americans' political experiment. Next, we'll talk to a political scientist who says that century-old tradition and kind of institutional norm protect minority rights, well, maybe less democratic than you think and might even be causing some long-term damage. More on that later. Actually, on the other side of this break, we're streaming America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony DeVolder from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman.
Thank you for joining us on Person to Person. Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom. We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job?
I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education. If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
Welcome back to America Decides. Let's start with some basics. One feature of the American democratic experiment in the legislative arena has been preservation of minority party rights. It's written into the U.S. Congress and how it does its business. Almost every state legislature in our country has mechanisms to protect minority party rights. This is an outgrowth of the founding of our country, when the founders were not only concerned about monarchies and kings, but they were concerned about majorities, even duly elected ones, running roughshod over minority parties in a legislative context. And this has achieved what we now regard as an institutional set of normality around it. But over the past 250 years, some political scientists, like Harvard's Daniel Ziblatt, think a few of those century-old institutional norms, well, maybe they become antiquated, possibly even fundamentally undemocratic. In a new book he co-authored called Tyranny of the Minority, Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky examine the rise of what they describe as an increasingly extremist Republican Party, despite that party's struggle to win the popular vote. Daniel Ziblatt joins us now. Daniel, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. I want you to explain what you mean by tyranny of the minority.
Well, we're the only democracy in the world where it's possible to lose a popular vote for the presidency and yet become president. And that's just part of a broader problem in which political minorities very often govern over political majorities in the United States. Now, our Constitution is, of course, as you noted at the outset, a remarkable and at the time a revolutionary document. But if you look at the arc of history, Americans have done the hard work over the last 250 years of making their Constitution more democratic, as citizens have in other countries as well. Over the last 50 years, however, that's stopped, and we've actually stopped doing the work of making our Constitution more democratic, and that's resulted in a situation that we're in today. In many ways, I think the kind of sense of existential crisis in our democracy today reflects the fact that we've stopped making our Constitution more democratic.
Is that basically, Daniel, an argument against the Electoral College, or do you have other grievances with the way our institutions are currently not only designed but are functioning?
Yeah, so again, understand, I think the checks and balances are a remarkable set of institutions. The Bill of Rights protects individual rights. An independent judiciary is critical to protect those individual minority rights. All of that's really essential. But we have a set of institutions, including the Electoral College. We're the only democracy in the world with an Electoral College. Other countries used to have Electoral Colleges, dropped them. We're the only democracy in the world with judiciaries, a national judiciary without term limits or retirement age. And we're the only democracy in the world that has such a strong institution as a filibuster in one of our chambers. And so if you add up all of these institutions, you begin to see that we have a system that's tilted too far in the direction of the protection of minority rights to such a degree that it, in fact, allows minority interests to often trump majority interests. And if you just look at very popular things such as gun control, climate change, a lot of this stuff things that majorities of the population support, a lot of this stuff gets held up in our Congress and leads to a sense of dysfunction, which I think is contributing to the sense of malaise that many Americans feel about their democracy.
Daniel, I will confess I'm only halfway through your book, but I just got it yesterday in my defense. And the beginning of the book spends a great deal of time describing how other democracies in other parts of the world first faltered and then either fell apart or nearly fell apart. What are the instructive lessons you think Americans should take from the examples you and your co-authors cite about democracies that were once strong or fledgling and then found themselves in a moment of crisis and then either nearly or completely fell apart?
One thing to really keep our eye on, the lesson of history, I would say, is to keep our eye on whether or not political parties are committed to democratic rules of the game. To be a democratic politician or political party, it's in some sense very simple. You have to follow three basic rules, and this has been the case throughout history. Number one, you have to accept elections, win or lose. Number two, you have to not use violence to gain power or to hold on to power. And then number three, and this is slightly trickier, if you're a mainstream party or politician, and you have allies who engage in any of those first two behaviors, you have to distance yourself from them clearly, unambiguously, and cut all ties with those kinds of groups. What we see when we look back at history and historical examples of democratic breakdown, whether in the 1920s, 30s Europe or 1960s, 70s Latin America, what one often sees is, of course, there's extremists on the right and the left. The threats come from the right and the left. People attack Congresses, attack parliaments. The key issue is how do mainstream politicians respond to that? And when mainstream politicians don't condemn their own allies who engage in those kinds of behavior, that's exactly when democracy gets into trouble. When mainstream politicians, on the other hand, draw a hard line and say that kind of behavior is unacceptable, then democracy can in fact survive.
You use a term that struck me in the book, Daniel, semi-loyal Democrats. What is a semi-loyal Democrat, and how can we discern whether one exists or not?
Yeah, so if that checklist that I just gave you of those three kind of attributes of being a Democratic Party, that third attribute, again, which is the slightly more tricky one, which is the idea that you may look like a normal politician, you wear a suit and tie, you don't wear military garb, You kind of sound like a Democrat when you talk. You participate in normal debates. You appear on debate stages and so on. But if you're a politician who does all of that, but on the other hand, fails to condemn obviously anti-democratic behavior on your own side, then you're a semi-loyal Democrat. There's a term to describe that kind of behavior. And really it's intended to describe political leaders, political parties, and it's the semi-loyal Democrats in history who are the enablers. They're the ones who get democracy into trouble. We were really approaching these kinds of events, and this is how all democracies approach these kind of events on two paths. Number one, we have a legal system that holds people accountable for crimes, and that's absolutely necessary. But we often forget that there's a political process as well. Political leaders need to say such kind of behavior is illegitimate and unacceptable. If political leaders don't do that, especially again with people that they basically, it's easy to criticize, if you're a right-winger, to criticize communists on the left side. It's easy to, if you're a socialist, to criticize fascists on the other side. The question is, how do you respond to people on your own side? And in the case of the United States, as well as France, the failure to politically confront these kinds of actors who are on your side, I think, weaken a democracy. And that's clear, the clear lesson, I would say, from February 6th. And so it's really critical, I think, that all Americans understand that the January 6th assault was an assault. These were not heroes who engaged in this. They were a threat to democracy.
Daniel Ziblatt, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. The book again, The Tyranny of the Minority. It's been a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
That does it for today. I want to thank you for watching. You are streaming CBS News.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against?
I just worked harder.
The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military.